Opening merchant interface. Scanning trade routes. Scanning for cargo destinations within jump range. Cargo shipment available. 8 tons of 3D display modules and 15 tons of pewter Starship miniatures. Destined for the Altair system. Contacting Ken Burnside and Mike Llaneza of Ad Astra Games. Stand by.
Hi everybody, welcome to Traveller Mayday Mayday 2023. My guests are Ken Burnside and Mike Llaneza of Ad Astra Games, makers of Squadron Strike Traveller Edition, a 3D space combat simulator. Thanks for coming back and joining us for this 5th annual Mayday Mayday event. It's a pleasure to have you guys back.
It's a pleasure to be back.
Last year's interview was fun. Let's do it again.
Fantastic. I'm glad you enjoyed it and glad you came back. So, why don't you tell us a little bit about Ad Astra Games? Who are you and what do you do?
So Ad Astra Games is a one monkey supervised by one cat game publisher. I broke into the scene with publishing Attack Vector Tactical in 2004 and won an Origins Award for it. What sets my games apart is that they are actual, honest-to-God, playable, three-dimensional space combat and jet combat games. In 2018, I published a game called Squadron Strike Traveller, which was taking the Squadron Strike rules and reinterpreting the Traveller, all of the stuff that's from the various versions of Traveller, and trying to find the actual core of fun in space combat and Traveller. Mike Llaneza over here is my Traveller line developer and was a very brave man for taking on the Traveller writing project after I told him what had happened to the previous 4 people who had worked on it.
Yes, I've heard the story before. I'd like to hear it again. Apparently, this was a cursed project.
Yes, it was. The first person who was working on it, a fellow by the name of Steve Osmansky, did an awful lot of groundwork stuff that we still use, and then had a stroke. After Steve Osmansky had a stroke, I had to pick up the project again and was busy on other things and didn't know Traveller that well, other than having played it, mumble years before, and then moved it on over to Don McKinney, who was part of Mark Miller's, what do you like to refer to as the Traveller Kitchen Council, because they all lived within driving distance of one another and would get together and play over pizza and talk Traveller. And Don McKinney was basically one of the people who gets to tell Mark Miller, no, that would work better if we did it this way, for stuff leading up to Traveller 5. And Don McKinney was desperately trying to digest all of the naval stuff from Traveller, with all of the various disparate stuff that happened because Traveller accreted rather than was designed, and was working through that. And then Don McKinney had a heart attack and needed a quadruple bypass. While Don was recovering, I reached out to Lauren Wiseman, who had just had the GURPS Traveller contract go away, and a lot of his other freelancing work with Steve Jackson Games going away, and tried to get Lauren up to speed. And Lauren wrote a few things that we still kept. And then Lauren had a heart attack.
Yikes.
And died.
Oh no.
And then we tried to get Don McKinney back in as he was recovering, and then Don McKinney had a medical complication from bariatric surgery and died.
Oh no.
At which point I was desperate for anybody who could work on this, and handed on over to one of the people who worked on Attack Vector with me, Mark Graves, because Mark is a skinny guy and was working for the National Guard in Mississippi.
So you're looking around for healthy people to take over this project.
Yes. And then Mark packed himself up because his unit got to go to Kandahar. Because what Mark does, Mark basically worked in the intel shop. He has an interesting career. He Mustanged up to captain, and then in the reserves went back to being a sergeant.
Okay.
Because it paid better, believe it or not, with his specialties.
Oh, I see.
And also there was a billet open for it when he needed it. And there wasn't one for a captain that had never made major. So he got sent over to Kandahar. And he got flown in ahead, and all of the baggage train was on a series of semis that was going from Mountain Road in Kandahar. And that entire baggage train got demolished by Taliban mortars and rocket-propelled grenades, including his laptop with all the files that he'd been working on, including all of the Traveller books that he had taken with him.
Yikes.
2 years later, he made it back into the States and was, settling down in Biloxi, Mississippi, and was just, trying to get a job that was not involved, that would not send him overseas again. And then a hurricane hit. And during the course of the hurricane hitting, he did what all people who know that a hurricane is going to do to their homes. He went and packed up everything fragile or water damageable into his rented storage locker. Because the rented storage locker, because the place that has the storage locker is on the only hill in Biloxi, and everything in there has got a 6-foot high lip that you have to step over. So if your storage locker gets flooded, well, things have gotten really bad.
Mm-hmm.
It's time to look for a guy from Israel with a boat and convince him that he needs 2 of you to take with him. And as he was setting things up in there, why, look, in the back of his storage locker on one of his shelves, there's this box full of electronics. I don't remember what's in this. And there are 2 external hard drives. He plugs in one of the external hard drives. And there's this entire Traveller folder.
Oh, yay!
Which he said he didn't have time to work with, and he sent back to me. And that's when I talked Mike into doing the job.
So, Mike, why don't you tell us about how that call came in? And how you went from Traveller player to Traveller spaceship combat designer.
I've been a Traveller fan since, 1979. We had some literal photocopies of the little black books floating around the grade school. Because one of the first friends I made when I moved to California, his mother worked as a secretary in an office that had a really good Xerox machine. Isn't good enough as that you could pop the staple out of a 5x8 booklet and run it through the duplexer and get good copies. So stuff circulated. So we started off bootleg, played it some over the years, ran it a few times, and suddenly out of the blue, a game designer I knew says, "Hey, you want to be the Traveller guy?" I immediately said yes.
And did he tell you about the cursed that this could be detrimental to your health? Was he upfront about that?
He was upfront about that. Well, actually, since then, my career has actually rather prospered. So I think I broke the curse.
Fantastic.
Yeah, no, it worked out. It was exciting. I had to get my head around Squadron Strike as a game, and then the incalculable evil that is the Starship design spreadsheet for Squadron Strike. It's people at work who complain about spreadsheets. I show that to them, and they shut up.
Point of order: it is not incalculable evil. It calculates just fine.
I withdraw the phrase. Dove in and started thinking about where in Traveller's vastness to put it, and we settled on the 5th Frontier War really quickly. I picked out an isolated corner that didn't have a huge amount of previously published stuff about it for the 5th Frontier War, and we started sketching out storylines and scenarios and going through some really, really mind-bending brainstorming to try and map Traveller stuff to a Squadron Strike, and it ultimately came out and worked. There was easily six months where it looked like it might not.
Yes,
and then I think fortunately Ken had the inspiration for dealing with Sandcasters, and that made it actually work really well.
Any ship, any universe is your catchphrase, and so it sounds like you found a way to make it work for Traveller.
Yeah, one of the things that happened was that everybody who'd worked on this project ahead of time was trying to go and just directly translate Traveller mechanics to Squadron Strike. Rather than zooming back a little bit and saying, where's the fun? And to be fair, one of my favorite reviews of Squadron Strike Traveller from somebody who backed it on the Kickstarter It is one of my all-time favorite negative reviews. He basically chastised me for trying to make Traveller Space Combat a game where facing and position matters, and where I should actually roll dice when it should just be, well, I have this many Meson guns and this many ships on the enemy side, die.
Mm-hmm.
You tried to make Traveller Space Combat fun. I hate it.
So, Ken, how did you get started at Astra? First of all, what does Ad Astra mean?
Ad Astra means to the stars.
And what compelled you to start your own company? And what was your earliest product?
The first product that Ad Astra Games formally made came out in 2001. And it was a product called Delta V, which became the first draft of the game that became Attack Vector. Actually, really the second draft of it. And the other product that I sold was a t-shirt that says, give a person a relativistic rock and they will shatter a planet a day. Teach them to do the math themselves and they will shatter planets for the rest of their lives. And on the back of the shirt, I actually set up a physics problem that basically smashes the Earth with a relativistic rock launched from the from one of the Jovian Lagrange points. I still sell that shirt. Actually, I sell an even better version of that shirt. And every now and again, not so often since I haven't gone to conventions in 3 years, but every now and again, I walk around a convention and see somebody wearing it, and they'll come on up to me and say, "You made this shirt. It's awesome. By the way, this one's wearing out. Can I buy another one off of you?"
That's awesome. That must be rewarding.
It really is. Delta V became Attack Vector because of a name collision with a product produced by Fantasy Flight Games. And Delta V to Attack Vector was another 2.5 years of development work. Mike actually got to see some of the very early prototypes of Delta V way back when I visited San Francisco on a job interview. Introduced me to an artist named Josh Qualtieri, who worked for Pixar and I think still does. We basically built a world, and I set up a mailing list, and we pretty much did kind of a variation of the Great Game that was used by Mark Miller and company to set the background from Twilight 2000 to Traveller 2300 or 2300 AD. What I ended up doing was having people, one of them being Mark Graves, and 3 others who basically acted as agents of chaos. We gave everybody who wanted to run a planetary government to run. And we would periodically throw down, "Hi, this has happened on your planet. Write the press release of how you're solving it. Yeah, write the news story about how you're solving it." And then I would go and have somebody else go and write the countervailing report on how the government in power is screwing it up. And we went back and forth on this, and this sort of became a role-playing game with 10 players, 4 agents of chaos, and 3 people who more or less just gadflied around, Mike being one of them, going through and, "Oh, hey, I have a great way to write the opposition report on that one." It was great. It was a lot of fun. It was also an incredible time sink.
Right. Sounds like it.
And it was even harder to extract the useful information I needed from it at the end, which is the reason why I haven't tried doing it again. I mean, I was lucky at the time. I had a job that more or less let me bring a laptop in and read email between calls in the call center. They don't allow that anymore. There's no employer in the world that would allow you to bring a laptop into a call center these days, for good reason. Right. So Attack Vector came out. I got the Honor Harrington license, and by showing David Weber Attack Vector, and David played a little bit of Attack Vector. And you could see in his eyes "Oh, how I wish you had come out with this 20 years ago when I was single and had time."
That's right around the time when it was more like the 80s, Starfire.
Yes.
Starfire.
David Weber has a little-known early career as a game designer.
Yep.
Pocket Edition Starfire from Task Force Games was really popular at grade school. We also played some Starfleet battles, also so similar sized edition back when you could get a complete game for $5.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember Starfire. Did that eventually turn into Full Thrust, or is it those 2 different products?
Those are two different products.
Okay.
Starfire. So David did a lot of work for. David basically did Empires and the Gorm Khanate War for Starfire Second Edition. For Starfire 2, which was the effective second edition because the first edition, the first version of the game sold out. And those were the last of the versions of Starfire that came in 8.5 by 11-inch boxes. Well, almost the last of them.
Ziplocs.
Yep, Ziplocs. So
the tried and true distribution method.
Yep. So Starfire 3rd edition was David rebuilding Starfire from the ground up. I was part of that process. I was one of the playtesters for Task Force Games. This was also during a span when Amarillo Design Bureau was not precisely on speaking terms with Task Force Games because Task Force Games was very late in paying them royalties.
Amarillo Design Bureau, was that Steve Jackson's outfit?
Steve Cole's outfit,
okay.
Starfleet Battles.
Oh, right.
He's the designer of Starfleet Battles.
Gotcha.
I was doing, play testing for Starfleet Battles, and then got shunted on over in the early 1990s to doing play testing for Starfire 3rd edition. And we went through and did a lot of work on scenario books. Made a product based off of David Weber's second Starfire novel, Crusade. I was instrumental in that. And then we got the manuscript for David Weber's Starfire novel for Insurrection. In one battle, there are 30,000 gunboats.
Yikes.
Each gunboat in Starfire is represented by a single count. There were 70,000 fighter squadron. There are 70,000 fighters or 72,000 fighters, but at least one counter was 12 fighters. And most of the interesting excesses of Starfire 3rd edition more or less came from David. When Task Force Games basically went out of business in 1996, and Steve Cole bought the Starfleet universe back from them, or took it back from them, is a better way to describe it, they had sold Starfire to a guy by the name of Marvin Lamb, who was the chief developer. Marvin and David tried to make an agreement where Marvin could do more books based off of where Marvin could do more books based off of David's books, and it kind of fell apart. Since then, borrowing a march from Starmada, Marvin has produced 4 more editions of Starfire, but he doesn't actually give them edition numbers like 1st edition, 2nd edition, 3rd edition, 3rd edition revised. It's Solar Starfire, it's Imperial Starfire, it's Galactic Starfire, and it's really hard to tell from those names which one is the most recent version. Full Thrust got its start right around the same time that I was working on Starfire, produced by John Tuffley in the UK. Came out with Full Thrust, More Thrust, Full Thrust 2nd edition, and Fleet Book 1 and Fleet Book 2. So there are basically 4 products out there. And about the time that I was getting started on Attack Vector, people were telling me on the SF Consimel mailing list that there's no point in making a new vector movement game. Full Thrust 3rd edition is right around the corner. Full Thrust 3rd edition has still not come out yet, in part because Tuffley went and asked his inner cadre, his guys who know all the rules, to copy and paste and make an end-to-end, every rule sorted in the appropriate place, one massive rule book for him, and looked at it and suddenly lost interest in making Full Thrust 3rd edition, because his mental image of Full Thrust is that Full Thrust is a game that, sure, it's got 8-point type, but it fits into a 32-page center staple booklet. The reality of Full Thrust is that if you have all of the rules in it, it is about a 300-page rule book. And worse yet, he ended up including different versions of the same rule in each of those products in many cases. So now you have holy schisms over which version of the point defense rule is correct, because there are 4 different versions of it.
Mike, let's talk a little bit about how your experience playing Traveller Tabletop influenced your design on the Traveller expansion.
It gave me a good insight into the feel of the setting, a 1970s oriented retro future, in a sense for what the various organizations in the setting were like, and a little bit of what it's like to run around in a small ships that are basically too minuscule to even represent at the scale we went with for Squadron Strike. Traveller.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, sorry. I think it gave me valuable insight, and since a setting I have a deep and old love for, at motivation to do a really good translation and make it really fun. I think that's the biggest push. No, very little direct mechanics. It's just that I have my own headcanon for Sandcasters and a few other things, but I went as authentic as possible, and I think I hit that.
Mm-hmm. Sandcasters were one of the big changes that we had to make for Squadron Strike. Canonically, a Sandcaster can be thought of as a smoke cloud. You punt it on out there, and it is a rapidly expanding cloud of reflective dust that mucks up lasers, and later on became something that, oh, hey, if a missile crashes through this at high speed, it'll probably die. When you look at the physics of Sandcasters, what you have is a very large particle size ideal gas expanding in a vacuum. And there are equations for the Boyle's ideal gas law is the one that's pertinent here. And it turns out that the canonical Traveller Sandcaster doesn't match physics, but okay, it's part of Traveller. What does it do? It adds a die roll modifier for certain weapon attacks coming in that go through the hex. This is easy to do in 2D. It is not easy to do in 3D. It is possible to do it, but it rapidly turns into, in programming terms, an n squared minus n problem, because you're constantly doubling the number of bearings you're shooting between two ships to see whether or not that sand cloud is in fact going to interfere with the shot. What I did was I made Sandcasters into SFB style shields, but you have banks of Sandcaster ammunition. One unit of Sandcaster ammunition puts one set of 6 shield bubbles up on that particular facing of the ship. And at the end of the combat phase,
it's like an ablative shield that can get shot down.
Yes, so it's like an ablative shield that can get shot down.
It takes ammo.
But it takes
and you have to renew. Right, gotcha.
But it takes ammunition to renew.
Mm-hmm.
And suddenly this turned the which way am I getting shot from thought process into a really interesting brain burn.
Yeah, because it's actually, where might I get shot from? Mm-hmm. And do I think I'm likely enough to get shot from that direction to burn some Sandcaster ammo?
To reinforce, air quote, reinforce that facing shield.
Yes.
Right.
And we even actually allow the standard Squadron Strike shield reinforcement mechanic, where you spend 1 action point for 2 more virtual bubbles on that side without burning additional ammunition, because you are directing your bridge crew to make sure that it's extra dense on that on the bearing to that target,
mm-hmm.
or on the bearing on that side of the ship. And we slipped in a little bit of canonical bits into this, or not quite canonical bits, but post hoc explanation of this in some of the fiction, where we basically said that the sand is piezoelectric crystals that are held by a magnetic field.
I like that idea. It's like a point defense shield that you can move the dense parts to where you want them to be.
More or less, yeah. And then we had to go through and, I won't say trim down, but find a useful role for every single weapon that Traveller had named for spaceship combat. We had energy beams, fusion beams, and fusion guns, all with very slightly different rules published decades apart, that we condensed into energy beams. And then we basically went and they all had similar descriptions of what they did, but slightly different rules. And we made the energy beam the de facto most horrifying short-ranged weapon that you can face in Traveller. When you played with us last year, you were the one, Frank, when you played with us last year, you were the one who actually got the close-range energy beam shot with your Aslan ship against the Zodani destroyer.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember how horrifying that was when it hit?
Yes, it was pretty nasty.
That Aslan destroyer is, I think, my favorite ship in the game, and I got a very clear idea in mind of what I wanted it to do, and I was able to hit it just about perfectly in the design rules once I got rolling with them.
I really like the avid system and the turn-based movement, and kind of like trying to figure out where the other guy's going to be in the next move. You know what I mean?
And the fact that there's a way to play it online with the Avid Assistant definitely helps.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that we did also at the very beginning was we defined that there were going to be 3 destroyers that could all be reasonable matches against each other, and these are the first three that we designed. They were the LCL. They were the LCL DDL. They were the Zodiac, and they were the BF Sloan. And we made sure we went through and made sure that every single one of them was just a little bit too small to actually mount a bay-mounted weapon in the nose, so that we had to make different compromises for how those weapons work and for how you mounted them on a ship. Because in Squadron Strike design, one of the things you can do is you can put a weapon that's just a little bit too big for the weapon mount if you're willing to accept an action point cost, a more limited firing arc, or a cooldown turn, or ammunition. Now, we can't actually use ammunition for beam weapons in Traveller because that just doesn't make sense in the universe. So that left us with the other three. And every single one of those baseline destroyers has one of those choices in there, and that makes the ugly decisions that you make while flying the ships more interesting.
That is interesting. So, can you tell us some what makes Squadron Strike unique compared to other space combat games on the market?
Two big things. The first one is that it flies in 3D, and it really actually does fly playably in 3D. We use tilt blocks and box miniatures and stacking tiles to show altitude and orientation on the map where it's supposed to be, so that you're not spending half your time asking, so are you pitched right or left over there, Bob? Going across the table as you're looking at the flat counter.
Right. So you actually have these little standoffs for the physical game?
The box set comes with punch-out counters that fold up into cardboard boxes with art on all six sides. There are little plastic tilt blocks that look like a cube with a 90-degree cut taken out of the middle of it, so it looks like a chair. The shallow angle is pitched up at a 30-degree angle. The steep angle is pitched up at a 60-degree angle. And with two of those, you can show any degree of pitch and roll in 30-degree increments. And on a hex map, you can show 30-degree increments by facing your ship at a hex corner as well as a hex side. So
gotcha.
It's full 30-degree articulation.
And thanks to all the little plastic components in there, a Squadron Strike box set passes the Christmas morning test.
Something in there shaking.
And the other thing that sets it apart, aside from the 3D, is that, as you mentioned, the tagline is any ship from any universe fully 3D. And Mike has already made a joke about the the calculable horror of the Squadron Strike ship design spreadsheet. It really does have an amazingly rich design space. For example, Squadron Strike has 3 different movement modes. They are named after the number of Newton's laws being obeyed. Mode 0 obeys none of Newton's laws. When you turn off your engines, you quickly skid to a halt against the carpet friction of the vacuum.
Luminiferous ether, surely.
Yes, it's the ether.
If you have Mode 1 movement, you can accumulate speed from turn to turn to turn. Mode 0 movement has a maximum speed. But if you turn off your engines, you keep on going in the direction you were facing. As you change heading, and I'm doing this as I'm moving my hands around my microphone, demonstrating that you can't, not that you can see that, but
you can turn your ship, but you're still going the original direction.
You can turn your ship, but your ship is still going to go in the direction, is going to go forward. Boldly going forward because we can't find reverse. When you turn your ship, you bleed speed off a numinous ether of space. And this is the Lucasian model of physics, named after noted documentarian George Lucas. Every single time you've seen an X-Wing go and bank and turn and slow down, that's physics in somebody's universe. Mode 2 movement is using 2 of Newton's laws. Your ship has vectors that are independent of the facing. So if you apply a vector of 4 hexes per turn in direction A, to stop, you have to swivel 180 degrees, which may take more time than you think it does, and then apply 4 units of thrust in direction D to stop. Mode 3 movement is attack vector. In attack vector, we have fuel. And as you burn fuel, your ship gets lighter. And as your ship gets lighter, the remaining fuel, A, gets more efficient because it's pushing less mass, and B, your maximum thrust can increase.
Interesting.
Having done attack vector first made it ever so nicer to do Squadron Strike, because I could say, no, I already did that. I don't need to include that in this game. The goal of Squadron Strike was to basically mate the 3-dimensional movement system from attack vector with the plot, move, shoot sequence of play of full thrust and Starmada. because when I published Attack Vector, I was still pretty heavily into, when I wrote and published Attack Vector, I was still pretty heavily into Starfleet battles, and everything was segmented movement.
Right.
And segmented movement is a wonderful, wonderful tool, but it is not, but it is not conducive, especially with vectors, to running lots of ships at once. With computer assistance, some of the people on my server can run 2 to 3 Attack Vector ships at once. Before computer assistance, I could run 3 ships at once, but it was a brain burn. One of my buddies who I played with locally in Milwaukee could run 3 ships at a time, but he complained about it because he couldn't do that and drink beer at the same time.
That is a valid objection.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
When we used to sit down to play Starfleet battles, we're like, no more than 2 ships each, please.
Mm-hmm. And when I was playing Starfleet battles regularly, I could regularly run 3 to 4 ships at once, but that was because I did not fill out the energy allocations one at a time. What I did is I would go and plot the speeds for all the ships at the same time, figure out what was left, and then plot out what was left for weapon arming, and make sure that my fleet speeds were going at a reasonable speed.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, Starfleet battles really has a problem with the Empire State Building formation. You are so much better off sticking all of your counters in 1 hex in Starfleet battles. So much so that when I was in the part of the development process for Federation Commander, we basically made it so that if you had more than 3 ships at a time, all of your shields collapsed. Just to avoid that problem, so that people would spread their fleets out more.
And then it got recreated even worse with the David Weber-based game.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any other, do you have like a main competitor? I've never seen anything like your product.
So there is a friend of mine who played Attack Vector and bounced hard off of it and said, I can do better than this, for making a 3-dimensional game, by the name of Todd Boyce. So Todd Boyce is an animator who basically works on 3D graphics on many of the movies that you have seen and have enjoyed over the years. A lot of them, his name is somewhere on the credit sheet. Todd was a big fan of Babylon 5 Wars and was not a fan of Starfleet battles, and thought that I borrowed too much from Starfleet battles for Squadron Strike, or not for Squadron Strike, for Attack Vector, and really didn't like the mechanism by which I reconciled vectors, because he was trying for a close-in pass, turned off his engine, completed a pivot, and his vectors changed, and suddenly he skidded left when he thought he was going to be going right, and suddenly his range 2 pass was out of arc, and didn't like that much. If you're trying to do a close range pass in Attack Vector or even in Squadron Strike, you're probably making your life harder than you need to. So he put out a game called With Hostile Intent, or rather, he's put out 2 playtest versions of it. Then his career got interesting, and he moved from California to Texas, and then the movie company he was working for Texas suddenly let everybody go. And he moved from Texas to Florida, and then moved back to California briefly without his wife after she had given birth to twins. That was an interesting time for him, and has been basically raising children and working as the in-house animator for a company that makes cinematic training modules in Texas. And the way he describes it is that they sold the house in Texas to move to Florida, and they bought the house across the street from the house they sold in Texas when they moved back to Texas.
We can see our old house from here.
Yes, he could.
There it is, right?
That's got to be weird.
Yeah, it is weird. Go on.
With hostile Intent is 3D and uses a square grid, and interestingly enough, you don't actually put your miniatures on the square inside the squares on the grid. You put them on the vertices of the square. You put them on the vertices, and it deals with 45 degrees of freedom rather than 30 degrees of freedom. It is. He has a line of miniatures for them that came out in 2007 or thereabouts. They're very nice, and he hasn't put out anything for them since because, again, raising children.
Mike, do you have a? Well, I'll have you both answer this, but let's bounce back and forth. So, Mike, what's your personal favorite sci-fi book, movie, or TV show, and how has it influenced your work?
So that's a solid question. Let's see. Now I'd actually thought of an answer from the list you sent out, and I'm drawing a complete blank on that. It's a really hard question for me to answer because I am very omnivorous with science fiction, and you
don't have a favorite IP?
It's really tough. I mean, I'm juggling Star Trek and Star Wars shows at the moment. I oddly enough bounced really hard off of The Expanse, so I'll just confess that up front.
Mm-hmm.
And I gave it.
I did too.
I gave it 4 episodes.
Oh, you literally quit you literally quit on the worst episode.
Well, that's a reason for it, and also what really drove me off of that was I don't like any of the characters as people.
Mm-hmm.
There's one interesting character who I'll be following, and you know who she is. But beyond that, no, these people are jerks. I don't want.
No character really relatable to you.
Right. I don't want any of these people in my living room.
Mm-hmm.
But for books, I'll bounce around. I've read an awful lot of Mill SF.
Mm-hmm.
Finally ended up bowing out of the Honor Harrington stuff when it at the point where it got ridiculous for me. This may or may not be where it got ridiculous for other people. But I just enjoy things like Glenn Cook's Passage at Arms, which is literally Das Boot in space.
Yes.
Even down to the conceit of having a former officer turned journalist come along for a mission. That's a really tense, well thought out book. It's got some great combat sequences and some very interesting ideas. And I think I really draw a lot from that. That's my baseline standard for quality for anything in science fiction is think your stuff through. If you've introduced a particular gizmo, be consistent about how you use it and come up with other ways you can play it with. The submarine analogs in Passage at Arms, they're called climbers. And what they can do is move partially into another dimension. It's called somehow, I forget the why that's called climbing, but that's what they're called. And that reduces your visual signature down to the angstrom scale if you go really high. You can't, and of course, you can't radiate heat. So you've got a clock on your climb time.
And that is one of the very first uses of waste heat as a limiter on space combat in science fiction.
Yes, it is. It's completely divorced from his other books. He likes mostly fantasy stuff. It's a really good ones at that. But he really nailed a lot of the hard SF elements for it. And so you've got climber hunters who at one point they're hiding because they just whacked the enemy fleet base, and so they have to hide away. They climb really high and go into a large asteroid, which the hunters then proceed to nuke the living daylights out of and break it down to gravel. They get away. They run it. They get tasked to hit an enemy capital ship, which lost its FTL drive, so it's running at a relativistic velocity. They deal with that by climbing up really high and disrupting the fusion power plant. They have to do it a couple of times to basically get run over, and they ultimately get it and take a really huge whack. And it's like temperature suddenly spikes, and it's like, okay, we got to get out of here and get down now. Really interesting stuff. Won't spoil anything further, but it's highly recommended. It's a candidate for best space combat novel ever written. And thinking through what gadgets you have, coming up with clever ways to use them, I think that helped give me the mindset to wrap my heads around Traveller and abstract it just right to fit into the Squadron Strike rule set.
Good answer. All right. Ken, what's your favorite sci-fi book or TV show or IP that has influenced your work?
So I have a bit of fondness for The Expanse, in part because the 4th copy of Attack Vector we ever sold was to Ty Frank, one of The Expanse authors. You can kind of see some places in The Expanse where I won't say he copied me, but you can see that we drew from the same sources. What I like in my science fiction is actually less space combat, because now I have opinions about space combat, and if I read space combat by science fiction authors, I sigh and have to turn part of my brain off to go and say, no, it doesn't. No, stop that. Enjoy the book. Don't fix it. Just enjoy the book. So I look for sociological science fiction, and 2 of my favorite authors are C.J. Cherry and John M. Ford. John M. Ford wrote a whole bunch of Bildungsromans and wrote one of the best anthropological science fiction novels ever as a Star Trek novel called The Final Reflection. And it should be noted that every time John M. Ford turned in a novel for pocketbooks for their Star Trek line, Paramount went and changed the rules so that somebody else couldn't do the same thing. But The Final Reflection is a novel told from the perspective of a Klingon orphan who eventually rises to commanding a spaceship and is assigned to go fetch the Federation ambassador, the very first Federation ambassador of the Klingon Empire. And he lets in little details like the fact that the Klingons the Klingons list their first contact with the Federation as being 24 years earlier than the Federation lists contact with the Klingon Empire.
Because the Federation is listing that ship as missing in action.
Right.
Interesting.
And his take on Klingon culture is really fascinating. It was used as the baseline for the fastest Star Trek RPG, and quickly became non-canon with Next Generation. There are still a few details of the Ford variety of Klingons that have worked their way into canon, but of all of the people that I know who work professionally on Star Trek, the only outsider that they ever wish that Paramount had just grafted into the canon is John M. Ford's Klingons.
With a secondary list for Diane Duane's Romulans.
Yeah.
And I really wish David Gerald had let her write a few scripts while she was his assistant on TNG.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Final Reflection also includes the biggest bomb any Klingon has ever dropped. It's they get to Earth to pick up the ambassador, and they're invited to a demonstration of a new Federation technology, the Federation's first practical transporter, which the Klingons already have. So they do their dog and pony show, and then somebody beams in, and they go, "Any questions?" The Klingon stands up and says, "Why does yours make that horrible noise?"
And then they beam out.
Silently.
That's pretty funny.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's putting the cat amongst the pigeons.
Mike, do you have any favorite memories or experience from gaming conventions or events that you've attended related to Squadron Strike or Traveller?
Let's see. While meeting up with Ken and a buddy of mine in a game store in San Francisco to play Attack Vector or play test Attack Vector and then have some really good Chinese food, that was a lot of fun. I'm very, very fond of that.
Oh, so jealous. I love Chinese food.
Oh, we are so spoiled for choice in San Francisco. I'm currently rocking a Thai barbecue place that's really, really good. Just opened, 5-star reviews all over the place. One of them mine. But also for conventions, I actually don't do conventions a whole lot. But when I was a kid in high school, some of my buddies and I would split a room at Pacificon. That was fun. It's basically you've got a room, but that's just a place you can lock to keep your stuff. Stayed up all night gaming, like getting in a full seven player game of board game Civilization. That one still stands out. Did play a tournament in Starfleet Battles. All right, this is confession time. Especially when I could theoretically afford to make good if anybody wanted to call me on it. I took in an Andromedan ship, and well, Andromedans in tournament play are target one for everybody. So I was the first person out, and so I went over to the I think it was still task force running it there. Went over to the tournament organizers and said, "Yeah, I was the first out." And they said, "Great, congratulations," and handed me a bunch of stuff.
Oh. As a consolation prize or what?
I think they said I took first place. But maybe it was but I decided to roll with the consolation prize idea and then just basically avoided that half of the dealer's room for the remainder of the weekend.
And what about you, Ken? Any favorite memories or experiences from gaming conventions or events?
So I have a lot of them, but for me, there is basically a period. There's before 2000 and there's before 2000 and after 2000. Before 2000, I went to game conventions and played games and had fun. After 2000, I go to game conventions, and now it's a place where I make sales, and where I do game demos to try to generate sales, and periodically try to sneak on out and play some games for fun. So pre-2000, I went to one of the very first BattleTech tournaments at Gen Con. I was 19. I spent my Alaska permanent fund dividend check to fly to Milwaukee to go to Gen Con. And I was a BattleTech nerd.
Mm-hmm. Love BattleTech.
So this is before they figured out the problem with using tonnage as a balancing system. And it was a bring 400 tons and your lance against my lance, and whatever survives moves on to the next round with a limited budget for fixing and repairs. They didn't allow any custom mechs, but they did allow me to bring in 400 tons of Savannah Masters.
Which are light mechs?
No, those are 5-ton hover tanks that move 1117 with a medium laser on them.
Mm-hmm.
And
so they're using the GEV rules or whatever, their Aerotech or whatever.
It's in the 3026 technical readout.
Yeah, right. Mm-hmm.
So they move like a mech. They can't enter woods, but they move 1117. And I don't have to worry about heat from moving or firing my medium laser because the fusion reactor has 10 heat sinks. Medium laser generates 3. Moving at 17 generates 2. I've got 5 heat capacity left. Now, sure, if you hit it with anything substantial anywhere other than the front armor, it's going to die fast. But you're rolling initiative 4 times. I'm rolling initiative 80 times. What do you want to bet I can get a vehicle that moves 17 hexes per turn onto your rear armor?
Right. So you must have mastered that. Mastered that game.
I ran the Savannah Master course through, and then they casually mentioned that, oh, by the way, your vehicles don't get repaired between rounds. So on the first round, I had 400 tons of Savannah Masters. The second round, I had like 340 tons of Savannah Masters. The third round, I was down to 270. And that's
quantity has a quality of its own.
And that's when they said that in the next edition of the rules, all vehicles automatically lose all initiative to all vehicles automatically move before all mechs, regardless of initiative rolls.
I was gonna say you lose initiative. Okay. That's funny. I like how they're like adjusting the rules as they go to avoid problems with you next year.
Yes.
Or in the next round. So Ken, how did you get involved in the Traveller license? Were you just looking around for ways to expand, or did people come out of the woodwork and say, "Hey, I think this would be cool if this was Traveller"?
So, we got the Honor Harrington license for when I had Attack Vector. We did 2 editions of the Honor Harrington game. The first one I still apologize for. The second one is actually a fair amount of fun. And we started looking for other licenses. And it just so happened that, we lived in Milwaukee. Mark Miller lives in Clinton, Illinois. And roughly 1/3 of the way, if you took a line between Milwaukee and Clinton, 1/3 of the way north from Mark is a convention called Winter War, which was run by Don McKinney. And we came down and talked to Mark. Mark knew my business partner, Scott Palter, from way back, and just chatted about doing a license, as I did a little bit of show and tell on Attack Vector at the time. Mark felt that Attack Vector was way too complicated for anything Traveller related. And I said, I have another game in development that streamlines it and simplifies it. And Mark said, sure. And we cut him a check. And had the license and did nothing with it for a terrifyingly long period of time, because I was busy working on the Sith stuff and then working on Squadron Strike, and didn't have time to do the deep dive into Traveller needed to become a subject matter expert on it. And that was where we got Steve Osmanski in as the subject matter expert, and went on from there.
Mike, what do you hope Traveller fans will appreciate most about the Traveller license version of Squadron Strike?
I want people to come off and say that that's just how a battle would go. That's how these ships would fly. That's how these ships would fight. And,
like that, saying like that's how I imagined it.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's harkening back. I mean, they're way back in the day. They put out a Space Combat supplement or full game Mayday, which I'm sure which I will mention for the audience. I think from the title of the convention, I think you might be aware of that one.
It sounds familiar.
Yeah, and that had some phasing, and then we played some of that back at the grade school.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to give people, hey, this is what it was like in the Fifth Frontier War. These are some of the important things that went down that maybe didn't make the main line, but it's a sideshow. But any battle is important to the people who are in it, and I want to flesh out the history for them a little bit. Maybe play with some what ifs. There's a hypothetical scenario in the First Fleet book, and
there are refitted versions of ships that are not exactly Traveller canon, but likely should be.
Mm-hmm.
I think that we have a great patron giving a group of PCs a mission in the differences between the original Gianetti and the refitted Gianetti. The original Gianetti light cruiser is a 30,000 ton light cruiser that is armed with a spinal Meson gun. It has decent amounts of sand and pretty well armored for something its size. That, by the way, was one of the other major changes that we made for that shook out very late in the design process, was deciding that no, making armor 4 a very high armor value and scaling the weapons to that was a good idea. What the Gianetti has is a spinal mount Meson gun, and it's the smallest thing that the Imperium mounts with a spinal mount Meson gun. It most notably does not actually have a Meson screen.
Interesting.
And it is a big, and that's in the canonical supplement 9 listing for it. And it doesn't have a Meson screen because of the amazing pipeline that GDW is using to produce products. But it doesn't have a Meson screen. The refitted one does. And
that's about the only change.
And that's about the only change. And what I'm imagining is that some admiral who was part of the procurement process had his son going on out as the executive officer on a non-refitted Gianetti, which blows up because it doesn't have a Meson screen.
Right.
And it's just big enough to be worth using one on.
Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. And this admiral hires the PCs and says, this is entirely off the books. These were the plans for the Gianetti class light cruiser. Note the existence of compartment 23B on these plans. These are the reports of the Gianetti light cruiser as it came out of the shipyards. Note the contents of compartment 23B. Note that it does not have a Meson screen. It's supposed to. I want you to find the people who are responsible and bring them to me. Alive. Not necessarily healthy, but alive.
So what kind of feedback have you guys received from the Traveller community about Squadron Strike? Was it well received, or were people kind of grumpy about it? I mean, people like what they like, and they don't like to see their things change. But on the other hand, there's another camp that likes to see things updated and brought into other fields.
The initial reviews were quite good, although a number of people who were basically expecting a better version of High Guard kind of went, "Oh my God, what have I gotten myself into?" There is the review that I mentioned earlier that I'll mention again, which was somebody saying, "You've managed to make maneuver matter in Traveller space combat. You've made damage or different facings matter. You've made me care about damage on individual parts of the ship. You're trying to make Traveller space combat with big ships fun. I hate it."
And we also had the review from the fellow who fell in love with the Meson gun as we implemented it.
Mm-hmm. he said that the very first thing that he did was he took a Gianetti light cruiser and lined up a shot on a Zodiac, playing it solo, and he rolled the Meson gun and hit location 4, and the Zodiac just blew up. And then he tried it again, and then he tried it again with a new Zodiac, and the Zodiac didn't quite blow up, but oh dear Lord, did you know that it had gotten hit?
Right. I think that's what happened to me. I didn't blow up the ship I was shooting at, but I did damage it very, very badly.
You got a close range pass with the bay-mounted energy beam on something that's after the sand had been blasted down by your lasers, and then you went and rolled a damage 2, penetration 8 weapon with bursting, and that was not with bursting, with splash on it, and you rolled pretty well. You got like a penetration roll of 6, and.
Can everybody just line up in front of my bay gun, my spinal mount weapon, and in an orderly fashion, please?
It wasn't a spinal mount weapon, but it was. No. The spinal mount, the one of the 3 hangout destroyers, the 3 start with these ships that has a spinal mount weapon, is the P.F. Sloan. That has that lovely spinal mounted bay particle beam that is longer range than anything else in its category.
So do you have any other Traveller related products that you're currently working on?
So we were going to try and get Traveller Shipbook 2 covering the Soleimani Rim War out last year. And then Mike got promoted.
Wait, promoted at Ad Astra or promoted at his other job?
Promoted to the job that pays him far more than I ever could.
Yep. Things got more than a little busy. Although right now I'm waiting on a set of spreadsheet revisions from Ken.
Yep.
And bang out a few more ships. And I'm thinking the big ships for the Aslan fleet.
Mm-hmm.
After Fleet Book 2, they should be all 3 fleets should be at 9 base hulls. With the usual 2 variants each. So I'm thinking at least the battle cruiser in the next wave, and do some revisions on the other stuff.
On the Soleimani stuff as well.
The Soleimani stuff I'm basing on the T20 version of that. They actually had a complete fleet book for the Soleimani with some designs that were initially. I started with a destroyer about 5,000 tons, as we do, and the first literal translation became very clear that I should be taking more of the spirit than the literal translations, because that sucker has a thrust of 2, which is not completely unreasonable in High Guard, but it makes you basically a stationary target in Squadron Strike. So that got revised real fast.
We had an awful time making the Azanti making the Lightning class work.
What was the big issue there?
Thrust 2.
Thrust 2.
Thrust 2 and a carrier without enough fighters to actually do anything useful.
Yep. And worse, they're Mode 2 fighters. And our recommendation is that yes, we will put fighters and carriers into the game. We just recommend that you don't actually use them. Because I spent.
Well, how do you strike that balance, though, Mike? Like between what's canon and what works for Squadron Strike? Are you good? You just erring on the side of fun, primarily?
I'm
not erring, but you know.
I have a very strong fun bias in game design, and the difference between Squadron Strike and Traveller ship design is that Traveller ship design is volume constrained and Squadron Strike is surface area constrained, which dramatically affects the number of weapon mounts you have. So I look at a High Guard design from, say, Book 9, Supplement 9, and I'm going, okay, it has fusion guns, no particle beams, some bay-mounted Mesons, and a bunch of lasers and sand. Okay, I recreate that as best I can, work out an interesting set of firing arcs that will work tactically, but make you make decisions,
Mm-hmm.
and go from there. So it was basically Supplement 9 for Imperials. The Zodani came out of actually the full thrust-based Traveller game Power Projection,
Mm-hmm.
which I was very glad to have because I did not want to have to do every half the ships in the game from complete scratch and pulling them out
Mm-hmm.
of jump space, as it were. But for the Aslan, those are all clean sheet designs.
Mm-hmm.
Pure Squadron Strike, no reference to canon. I looked at existing Aslan designs, both some fan-made ones and the old fastest ships, and basically said, okay, these are Aslan ships. How do they want to fight? They're not as bad as Xinti with the whole scream and leap thing, but
honestly, I think that the Aslan are based as much off of the Hani from C.J. Cherry's genre novels.
Yeah, definitely. So
rather than the Xinti.
Yeah, there's a teensy bit in there that the males can be pretty aggressive, but they're not stupid, and they're not as nearly rigidly bound by a code of honor. So the first Aslan ship was one of the first 3 destroyers, and I decided it's going to be the highest thrust and absolutely most maneuverable of the destroyers, and decided to go for a really nasty short range punch. I was thinking claws, so it got fusion guns.
Which we turned into energy beams, and honestly, I think that the energy beams were a little bit too short ranged. But the book Aslan, the original Aslan destroyer, not the leader variant, has like 6 energy beams, which is if it gets close to 2 ships of its size or a little larger and manages to survive long enough to get that close, things are dead.
Yep. Yeah, they are very short ranged, but I think we've seen in play over and over again. People get good shots with energy beams.
Awesome. So let's talk about current events. I know you guys purchased a license for your version of Traveller, but do you have any opinions on the Wizards of the Coast open jail fiasco?
So,
I'm not in the D&D or Pathfinder space, so that was just me getting to watch a large corporation trip over its own feet.
Mm-hmm.
So Pathfinder is the RPG I play for fun because it is not related to anything at all that I write for or work on. So I carefully segregate it, and I got to watch that. Blow up fast. I cheered on my friends at Paizo when they sold out of 8 months worth of a fresh reprint of their hardback book in 2 weeks.
Wow.
Yeah. So they basically do an annual reprint of the Pathfinder core rulebook, roughly in time to get new printings in-house for Gen Con. They sold out of the entire print run mid-January. The print run that had just landed for them at the end of July. And they don't do it so that they will immediately run out. They do it so that they know that they have 3 months before they know it's going to run out to put it back on the press.
Right.
So selling out of it just before they want to know they're going to put it on the press before they go to Gen Con. So they make sure they have enough to last through Gen Con plus about 2 months. And they sold out of that entire print run in mid-January.
Wow, that speaks volumes. Volumes.
Yes. Volume has a quality all its own.
So what do you think about, let's talk about AI a little bit. What do you think about the rise in popularity in AI? And do you have any plans to utilize AI in your products, like maybe AI controlled units or maybe you have, let's take it out of that context and say, like, what about AI systems on a ship? Would those be like something that, like an auto gunner, or like something that might be an expansion or an inclusion or a redesign?
I am unlike we don't actually track who's shooting which gun in Squadron Strike Traveller. You're on a crew of a naval vessel. It's big. There's lots of people who work on that. Whether or not it's crew with AI support, or everything is AI written and you have a crew of 5 living in a hermetically sealed bridge, it's Traveller. obviously it's it's crews of hundreds on there with retro with 1970s retro future technology and computers that are the size of a walk-in closet or bigger.
And robots. Traveller does have robots.
Yep.
Yep, and Traveller does have robots. So in one of the shims that I made to patch Squadron Strike into actually playing Traveller and caring about PCs on small little ships, one of the options there is you can actually have a program that runs certain jobs for you. And that program basically can never roll better than a 7. But it never has to roll. Meanwhile, for what PCs do in this, PCs roll their relevant skill check with a relevant modifier. And I stole a march from a game called Apocalypse World on this, which is very similar to Traveller in that it's basically roll 2 dice, add modifier, try to roll high. If you roll a 6 or less, you have failed. Something disastrous has happened. If you roll a 7, 8, or 9, you have a success with a cost. If you roll a 10, seven is it? Yeah. If you roll a 10 or if you roll a 10 through 12, you have gotten a complete success or a better success with a small cost. If you roll a 12 or higher, you've gotten something special. So what I did with that is that for the various jobs that a PC can do on a Traveller spaceship, I built a little table that says if you're using this skill, these are the special things you can select off the menu for rolling a 10 or higher. These are and if you roll a 12 or higher, if you roll a 13 or higher, pick 2.
Okay.
They only apply for this round, but it's basically using your Traveller skills to get bonuses in the Squadron Strike combat.
Gotcha.
Now, this is one of those things that we have tried to get play tested on Mayday for 3 years running now. And the end result is that the Venn diagram of people who can run Traveller at a convention online and people who know Squadron Strike seems to have no point of overlap.
Oops. And what about you, Mike? Do you have any thoughts on AI or its use in ships or its use in real life?
Well, AI support for filtering out noise is going to be very important in electronic warfare and sensor game for both real world and in science fiction. We'll see it come up a bit more, but in practical terms, in daily life, I would rather do a Google search if I'm trying to come up with some code and get the context of the answers off of Stack Exchange that way.
Mm-hmm.
Versus an algorithm that can be confidently wrong.
Right.
It's got some space. It's GitHub just announced their companion AI, which will do things like you can select a chunk of code and have the AI write your unit test for you. That's immensely practical, and using it as an assistant. I think there's some value there, but you got to test. You still have to understand
the
code. Yeah. You still have to understand the code that you're putting into production, and you absolutely have to test it because even the more sophisticated models that are coming out are still confidently wrong, and they're just making a confident guess at what the next sentence or line of code should be.
Right.
They're spicy autocomplete.
Pretty much. There's some value for that in support, and I think, and in gaming, I think it was Ubisoft just announced that for one of their projects, they're going to be using AI to come up with the NPC banter that's going on in the background in the game, which is
kind of cool.
That's actually a really clever use. It's the computer taking some of the drudge work away, which is what they're for.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a good idea. I played around with AI and I asked it about a topic that I'm an expert on, and it failed miserably. It looked like it was just sophisticated Mad Libs machine.
Yes, this is why I refer to it as a spicy autocomplete.
with VTTs becoming more popular, are you seeing more interest in people using your online Avid system, or finding it easy? Are you finding it easier to train people because they're already kind of used to gaming online like this? Kind of taking an analog thing and making it into a computer, like how you would tabletop into a VTT, for instance.
This is why we refer to the VTT site as Analog Space Combat by Internet. So we got a big surge when the pandemic happened. Honestly, Mike Zabrowski, the guy who does my coding, made me look like a frickin' genius. Because he had started working on the VTT in late 2018, and we had over a year of development in it when 2020 happened. Almost a year and a half. So it made me look like a goddamn genius for having this ready to go when the pandemic happened. Pure luck. Thank you, Mike. What I found is that during the pandemic, we had a big surge in play. And now that people are saying the pandemic is over, and with me with a chronic lung condition, I disagree vehemently. We're finding that it comes in waves. We try to get groups of people to come in and play together, and then one or the other of them suddenly gets a conflict on the night that we have our weekly meetups, and then they drop, and then their buddy drops, and then we have to go do recruiting again. Honestly, the biggest thing you could do to help me, or the biggest thing anybody can do to help me, is to go and play Squadron Strike in their game store. Because game stores only buy things that they have demand for. If they don't see anybody playing it and they don't see anybody asking for it, they don't stock it.
Gotcha.
And this is a purely demand-driven business because it's even worse than it was before. But 5 years ago, on any given month, the Alliance catalog, Alliance is the biggest game distributor in the country. On any given month, Alliance would be listing 360 brand new board games.
Wow.
Yeah. Any month, 360. And anything that was, and the next month, about half of those 360 would be replaced by 180 brand new board games. And then the next month later, another 180 brand new board games are replacing the ones that were previously listed. So your window of showing up in the Alliance catalog is about 60 to 90 days, unless you're Wingspan or something like it. And there is no way on earth that a game store can stock one copy of 360 new board games every month. They'll go out of business. They'll go out of business so fast. And it's not like any of these games are bad. Almost all of these games have production values that, my God, in 2000, if you had told me I could have gotten production values as good as small publishers are getting now by sacrificing an entire kindergarten class, I would have started sharpening my knife.
Yikes. Bad analogy.
But seriously, the production values are insane, and the game designs are really good, and they're just going on in. And if you're lucky, they're selling 1,000 copies through the game stores and direct off of, and another 1,000 off of Kickstarter. Because there are so many new games coming out there that's just. The two game clubs that I have contact with locally to me, they very rarely pull out anything that's older than a year, because there are so many good new games coming in out there that most of their games are only getting played 3 or 4 or 5 times.
So would you say people should go to their local game store and try to order there first, and then if they can't find it, hit the online or?
Yeah, if they can't find it, please hit me up at the company website. And if you're overseas, Noble Knight Games regularly restocks, and they can and they have black magic that they do for getting cheap shipping overseas that I cannot match.
I think I saw that they had copies of Netrunner available, which is like out of print. You can't find it anywhere, and they were for about the same price as the regular. The regular Netrunner, like the price hadn't increased because it's hard to find.
Also, speaking of things that are hard to find and have been out of print, I found the covers for printing power projection fleets. So I made about 6 copies of them, and there are like 3 copies left on my stock shelf, and I'll be reprinting those covers soon.
Oh, cool.
So Power Projection Fleet is a Traveller Space Combat game that I publish. It's not one I designed, but it's one that I published.
All right, cool. So is that, my next question was going to be, can you tell us of any new exciting products or releases at Ad Astra Games that are not Traveller related?
So games that I have, products that I have just released or released since the last time we came through. I have released Air Battle Rag 5 for Birds of Prey, which is basically their convention scenario product. And last year, we were desperately trying to get a very fast product out for Top Gun. It did not hit the stores at the time that we wanted it to, but Top Gun was still in theaters when we did put it out. But if you actually want to have all of the Birds of Prey scenarios and fighters from those little-known historical documentaries, Top Gun and Top Gun Maverick, I have them.
All right, awesome.
Coming up now, I am working on Exile Stars. It is also one of the things that is in the logjam behind the updates to the Squadron Strike ship design spreadsheet. But with any luck, I will actually be posting a new version of that tonight.
Oh, fantastic.
We are down to cross-checking. We're down to cross-checking and identifying glitches in the Fortress tabs with the changes we've been making. And as Fortresses are things that we don't use much of because it's hard to make a fight around a Fortress interesting, that's a low priority thing. One of the other things that we've done is that the Squadron Strike ship design spreadsheet now has an automatic conversion from Squadron Strike to Starmada because Dan Cast is a friend of mine, and this was a nice blowing off steam project. They have the same sequence of plays. Starmada is a much, much lighter weight game. Squadron Strike's sweet spot is about 2 to 4 ships per player with a peak of about 6. Starmada starts getting interesting at about 4 to 5 ships per player with a peak of about a dozen. But Dan is really, really good at getting the maximum amount of replayability and cleverness out of very simple mechanics. He's better at that than I am. So I like to just acknowledge that, he's better at that than I am. Where Dan has a problem is that he hates writing settings. Oh. So getting an automatic conversion from Squadron Strike to Starmada means that every new product that I come out becomes a freebie product for Dan. Gotcha. And the next 2 products that I am working on for Squadron Strike is Exile Stars, which can best be described as what would happen if you tried to make Star Trek with slightly more modern sensibilities, which means that you have to actually believe that computers are tools, not miracle machines, and you wanted to avoid the every season we run into 2 random gods on an abandoned planet. Mm-hmm. And it's got a very compelling setting. I've even got somebody working on an RPG for it, but that has had to be put on the back burner while I get other things done first.
I was going to say there's some speculation that Trelane was a Q.
There is. Mm-hmm. That's even the premise behind one of the Star Trek novels that came out in the late 1990s.
Oh, really? Interesting.
Yeah.
Q who and that's a real banger.
So the other product that I have that I have in the offing is Newton's Cradle, and I showed you a little bit of Newton's Cradle last time around. So with Newton's Cradle, I have a game that is I have the Newton's Cradle product with ships, which are done, and I have the scenario book, which is mostly done. And I have a set of rules that I need to do layout on for a product called Wang Jian's War. And how people back in the 1980s or 1990s would talk about, I'm going to have a game that has an operational movement thing, and we're going to play out all the tactical battles. We're going to move our fleets around. The fleets are going to come in contact. We're going to play our fleet actions. This is sort of the premise behind Starfire in a lot of ways. And it never works. Because if you manage to make the operational game interesting, you end up with a situation where fleets come in and the fleet that knows it's going to get stomped just boogies out as fast as they possibly can. Well, it turns out that when your fleets require fuel, that becomes less of an option. It turns out that when you are fighting, when you have to worry about orbital mechanics, that becomes less of an option. And Wang Jian's War uses the orbital mechanics of the 4 Galilean moons and a couple of the bigger ones on the inside of them as your operational battle space for doing a war between Callisto and Europa. Callisto is using loner Martian ships. Europa is using hastily converted lunar refugee ships because the precipitating event was that one of the Martian governments triggered a Kessler cascade in the infrastructure orbiting over Earth. And Luna realized that without regular launches from Earth, it can't actually sustain the number of people that it has. So there was a big lunar diaspora, and that has turned into a proxy war in the middle of the Jovian system.
Interesting. Nice setup.
But you actually have orbital periods that you have to worry about, because they turn on and turn off adjacency between hexes. There are basically these long drawn out arcs that say these two hexes are adjacent along this arc on these turn numbers, and the turn cycle recycles every 12 turns. And each of the hexes has a fuel cost for what it would take you in fuel pips to move through this hex. And the fuel pips are exactly the same as the fuel pips that are actually on the Newton's Cradle ships.
Gotcha. Interesting. Very interesting. So here's a question for the both of you. Let's flip over to Mike. What do you think are the most important skills or traits for a game designer to have?
Well, some math is definitely required. Whatever you're doing with dice, you need to understand the numbers and the probabilities. You also need to be creative. You need to be able to think out of the box and come up with solutions to problems that are either better than or existing solutions or are unique. And you have to tie a whole bunch of disparate systems together in a cohesive way that's actually fun to play. So that requires a really strong sense of organization, a little math, and inspiration. You get lucky, and you need to always be thinking about give it a chance to be simple.
All right, that sounds like a good recipe. All right, how about you, Ken? What are your most important skills or traits you think a game designer should have?
So to me, a game designer should start out with a theme, and then ruthlessly question what is making this fun. Once you have found the fun in the game, then you can build it up and then put it in front of players. And being willing to being able to put your creative endeavors in front of players and watch them screw it up repeatedly, and discover that what you thought was fun was not fun. And go back and pull the fragments out of your ego, and try again and try again and try again, and ever so slowly. Actually, not slowly. Every time you have a play test that blows up badly, take lots of notes, because you have just been told where the most frustrating part of your game is.
Good advice.
Mathematical analysis is useful, but really it's more statistics than anything else. Jeff Engelstein has a Substack on this called Game Tech that is really good for refreshing yourself on the kinds of statistical analysis that you can do to make games better and to reduce some of the trial and error process of figuring things out. I also know some things about the GDW product production pipeline from way back in the day. So GDW for 23 years, was it 23 or 29 years? 29 years. 29 years from 1974 to 1993. For 29 years, GDW produced 16 games a year. And
I think that's counting Traveller supplements.
That's also counting Traveller supplements, but they produce 16 products a year. That is an insane production schedule. That is a crazy production schedule. And from talking to Lauren Wiseman, a lot of the process was Mark was the ideas guy. Mark was also the guy who was also the director of marketing and the token sensible adult in the company in a lot of ways, along with his wife Denise. Mark would come up with these ideas for a game. At the time, Mark would write these down as quickly as possible on a typewriter. And he would just sit there and pound on the typewriter for, 2 or 3 or 4 hours and produce a first draft of a game. He would then try to explain it to Frank Chadwick. And Frank would start asking a bunch of questions. And then Mark would get frustrated, throw the game down in frustration on the table in front of Frank, and Frank would go and rewrite Mark's first draft into a playable draft in about 2 days. And then Frank would hand that playable draft, typewritten, to Lauren, who would go through and proof Frank's somewhat questionable use of language. And Lauren would go in and fill in the gaps between Mark's first draft and Frank's draft. And then Lauren would go and take his draft to the local University of Illinois chapter, put it in front of the War Games Club, set up 2 or 3 tables of it, and run it all at once. Set 3 playtests up with college students.
Right.
Marking up his copy with 3 different colors of pens for what was found with each playtest group. Then he would come back in, fold in those complaints, hand it off to Frank again. Frank would grumble because Mark would have just dropped off a brand new game. Frank would grumble, think about these changes, write up rules for Lauren to patch in, and at this point in time, Lauren would go to the page layout machine, the page layout machine, which isn't quite a computer, but at least had copy and paste of paragraphs, so that he wasn't just retyping this manuscript multiple times every week. And then Lauren would take the game back to UIUC for another playtest weekend, come back with fewer complaints, maybe have time to get Frank involved on it, and then it was time to go and fill in the rest of the fluff for the game. One of the reasons why they loved Traveller and RPGs in general was that they don't require nearly as much playtesting iteration.
So with that, what's the moral of that story as far as important skills and traits for the game designer to have?
It's better to work as a team. And the other thing about it is that in some cases, better than is the enemy of good enough. We all know about Shattered Ships of the Fighting Imperium. That's an example of better than was not quite the enemy of good enough. But that's an example of where that development cycle bit them in the butt, because what would happen is that Lauren would get his second iteration of any ship design system or character creation system, and Lauren would be the one who designed most of the ships for it. And if he missed anything, like, say, a Gianetti needing a Meson screen and not having it, by the time he noticed it, the product was already in page layout. And it was often too late to change it and still meet the production queue.
Gotcha.
Because to produce a game every 3 weeks, more or less, that meant that Lauren was often juggling playtests for 2 or 3 games at once at UIUC, while writing. While he and Mark and Frank were writing throughout the week, or wrangling freelancers after about the mid '80s, and they had to do this to keep the doors open.
So we're basically at the end of our interview. Where can people find out more about Ad Astra Games and find your products, or follow you for news about your new projects?
So I'm currently active on Twitter, but with Twitter being what it is, I have no idea how much longer I'll be active. I'm Ad Astra Games at Twitter. I am Ad Astra Games at I'm Ad Astra Games at wargamers.social. Let me go on mastodon.com. Let me go pull that one up because I never remember. Wargamers.social. I'm Ad Astra Games at wargamers.social on Mastodon. And that is likely where I'm going to be if and when Twitter finally implodes. The company website is adastragames.com. And the virtual map where we go and actually play Squadron Strike and Attack Vector online on a regular basis is www.ascbi.net, ASCBI.net, short for Analog Space Combat by Internet.
All right, cool. And Mike, is there a way to contact you? Where do you hang out on the internet?
Oh, I still do some Twitter. I'm at Mike Llaneza on Twitter. I'm pretty much retired from Facebook, although I notice Ken still post there. There's a reasonably active Ad Astra group over there as well. So I'm also and Mike.Llaneza at gmail.com if anybody wants to send me some fan or hate mail.
All right, cool. Well, that's it. Thanks for joining us again for the 5th annual Mayday Mayday event. I sure appreciate you guys coming back and your support all along. And I think I spoke with Ken earlier that you guys are going to sponsor another Squadron Strike Traveller demo.
Yes, we are.
Fantastic. Great. I'll put links to everything in the show notes so folks can find it. And and that's it. So thanks so much, guys, for joining me again.
It was a pleasure as always.
It's always a pleasure, Frank. Thanks for having us.
And thank you, friends, for listening. Until next time, happy traveling.